My phone is there. It's fine. Is that okay? You need
No, I've got mine. All right.
a very good morning to all of you. Welcome to the 11th lecture in the Dean's 70th Anniversary Lecture Series of the School of International Studies. This happens to be the 11th lecture on the 11th of March at 11 a.m. So it's bound to be special. The series of the lectures are a part of the celebration of the completion of 70 years of our school, an initiative that was taken by our dean, Professor Amitabh Mattu. We trace the antecedents of our school right down to October of 1955, when the Indian School of International Studies was established at the Indian Council of World Affairs at Sapru House. And the idea was that India should have academic experts on international affairs and on area studies. The school was later merged with Jawaharlal Nehru University. This was around 1970. So we've had about 10 lectures so far since this is the 11th, and we've covered international studies in India, Nobel Prize in Economics, international law and international relations, India's development and its foreign policy, China's foreign policy, uh, lectures on West Asia, on human rights. The last one was on AI-based digital technologies for agriculture. So the lectures have been delivered by our former professors of our school, of course, and reputed international analysts as well as academics. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Susan Marks. She's Professor of International Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. The title of her lectures, as you can all see, is If the World is a Family, What Kind of Family Is It? So, before we begin, I'll request Professor Amitabh Mattu to felicitate Professor Marks with a token of our appreciation.
Yes, right behind you.
Okay.
This is a rather heavy murti of Saraswati. And just take a picture and then we'll just hand it back to you because it's heavy so that.
Now I request Professor Mattu to preside the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Preeti Singh, who is the brand custodian of the school as well as the convener of these special lectures. My dear colleagues, faculty members, students, and distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a privilege to welcome you to the, as you just heard, 11th lecture in the Dean's 70th Anniversary Lecture Series, commemorating 70 years of academic excellence at the School of International Studies. I have sat through many of these lectures, and it's a learning from a course on Buddhism that I'm undergoing these days. Is that when Buddha was aging and his disciples wanted someone to be in attendant, they chose Ananda, his cousin. Ananda had just one condition, that Buddha can never teach in his absence. So I make sure that any of these lectures I have to be present because I learn so much from them. And it's particularly fascinating that we've had these series of lectures, ranging, as Preeti pointed out, from West Asia to international law, and particularly because SIS has consistently pushed the boundaries of scholarly inquiry, and especially in its engagement with international law. In fact, as I was looking at the contents of its flagship journal, International Studies, which was born 4 years after SIS was created. ISIS was created in 1955, in 59. In the first issue, Volume 1, Number 1, January 1959, we had a brilliant article by Quincy Wright, who was then a visiting scholar of the school, on the Asian experience in international law. The same issue had an article which used to be which used to be a survey by Nagendra Singh and M.K. Nawaz. And Nagendra Singh, of course, later on became the first Indian to occupy the ICJ, again a visiting professor at the school, and one of the four judges of Indians who have become members of the ICJ, and the only one who became president of the ICJ. In the early years of international studies, we had extraordinary contributions from Indian scholars on international law, who almost single-handedly helped to construct what became known as the third world approach to international law. In the first years, there were articles which fell in the intersection of international organization and international law. R.P. Anand's seminal article, India and the World Court, and M.S. Rajan's article on the question of defining domestic jurisdiction helped create this new Weltanschauung. During these early years, we had extraordinary visitors, including those who have a deep connection with today's speaker. Arnold and Veronica Toynbee from the LSE were visiting scholars and again contributed to Volume 3, January 61, on the problems of international relations. Ilu Lotopact, son of the extraordinary Hirsch Lotopact, founder of the Lotopact Center at Cambridge, whose memory Professor Marx has delivered lectures, wrote a fine essay on international law in India in the 1961 issue. And today, therefore, we are privileged to host, and you had also articles by Norman Palmer, who was also, I think, at the LSE. Was he at the LSE?
Yes.
But Norman Palmer, whose concerns, including with Aboriginal rights, and were similar to yours, or different but similar to yours. Now, so today we are privileged to host Professor Susan Marks, a professor of international law at the London School of Economics, and a significant voice in the British radical tradition of legal scholarship. Professor Marks' work has profoundly shaped our understanding of dignity, global justice, human rights, and the role of law in international governance. Professor Marks joined the LSE in 2010 as Professor of International Law. She had previously taught at King's College London, and prior to that at the University of Cambridge, where she was a fellow at Emmanuel College. Amongst her books is the Trukanini's Stare, Reconsidering Dignity in Theory and Practice, based on the Lotopact lectures. There's an additional essay which explains the title, and perhaps in the Q&A, Professor Marks can give us the glimpse of that. And it talks about dignity in everyday life as a starting point for reconsidering the concept's history and significance. Similarly, another book which I have on Kindle is A False Tree of Liberty, which was affordable on Kindle, unlike the Trukanini's Stare, which is unaffordable on Kindle.
Yeah.
But which is a fantastic book which everyone should read, which revisits debate of Thomas Spence, and especially people interested in human rights. Her earlier works, many of you are aware, include International Law on the Left, Re-examining Marxist Legacies. I think Chimney has an article in that, right? Yeah, Chimney has an article. And also, which is probably the most famous book, which is The Riddle of All Constitutions, International Law, Democracy, and the Critique of Ideology. Our lecture today, as you just heard, is titled, and as you can see, If the World is a Family, What Kind of Family is it? Professor Marks will, I imagine, without anticipating what she will discuss, engage with the Indian adage, Udara Charitanam tu Vasudev Kutumbakam, which is the noble think of the world in one family, while the narrower think of us and them, my interests first. As you are aware, this ancient philosophical dictum resonates deeply in our contemporary discourse and also was encapsulated in the motto of the G20, one family, one world, one planet. Please join me in extending a warm and scholarly welcome to Professor Susan Marks, a model of scholarship and human values, as she takes the stage to share her invaluable perspective on this vital topic. Professor Marks.
Thank you so much, Professor Matu, for those incredibly kind words, and also Professor Singh for the invitation and for the organization of today's event. Sorry, that microphone was off, but I think you probably heard me expressing my thanks to the two professors for the invitation and for this incredibly warm and generous welcome. So indeed, my starting point for this research is that I arrived in India during the course of the G20 and found myself surrounded by posters with this legend, "One Earth, One Family, One Future," as it was called in English. You don't really need to be reminded of that, but there it is. And I learned later that that was referencing this Sanskrit mantra, to which Professor Matu has referred, more commonly rendered in English, I think, as something along the lines of "the world is one family, the world is a single family." Well, this appeal to, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. This appeal to envision the world as a family, as all one family, led me to think about the take-up of such an idea in international discourses and thematics more generally. And the result of my research on that topic to date is what I'm going to be presenting now. I'm in the process of developing it further for a book, so I'll be very keen to receive your comments and suggestions. What does it mean to represent the world as a family? To some of us, talk of the family will conjure up thoughts of security, constancy, intimacy, and belonging. Our mental picture of the family will be of unconditional love, a place of nurturing and support, the people we can always turn to in times of need. So the representation of the world as a family will seem like a way of emphasizing the unifying bonds, shared features, and areas of mutuality and interdependence that bring people and nations together. It will seem like a way of imbuing the conceptualization of the world with feelings of comfort, solace, safety, stability, understanding, trust, and love. For others, of course, the family will evoke a very different set of associations. If your experience of family life is of violence, conflict, indifference, cruelty, servitude, betrayal, and/or anguish, then the representation of the world as a family will seem far from benign. As one scholar observes, I'm now quoting, "The family is where most of the rape happens on this earth, along with most of the murder." And still quoting, "No one is likelier to rob, bully, blackmail, manipulate, or hit you, or inflict unwanted touch than family." From that perspective, we might be inclined to reverse the famous opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, in which Tolstoy writes of how all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. We might be tempted to reverse that and instead say that all unhappy families are alike and each happy family is a rare and distinctive anomaly. It seems reasonable to suppose that even at its best, the actual experience of being in a family may involve some fraught elements, however happy it may be, linked to such phenomena as anxiety, guilt, sacrifice, frustration, and repression. But we need to make a distinction here between the actual experience of being in a family on the one hand and the idea of the family on the other, what the family is held to signify, what it's imagined normally, properly, and truly to be. It's that idea of the family which comes into play when the world is represented as a family. Well, given the obvious fact that practices of family life have varied tremendously over time and remain ultra diverse and ever changing across the globe, something of which I've become very aware in my time in India, where your assumptions and ideas about family life are in some respects different from those with which I grew up, where, for example, a family unit includes the grandparents of the family, which wasn't the case for me. My grandparents left separately, and there was no assumption that they should spend much time with us. They had some grandparents who did, but they weren't part of our family unit. Anyway, so given this obvious fact of diversity over time and space, how can this work, that there is an idea of the family? It belongs with the idea of the family to set all that variation and diversity and mutability aside and put before us an idea of the family which is timeless, universal, and self-evident. We'll see what that might entail shortly. Well, clearly, we're speaking of a metaphor here. The world is not literally composed of a single family. Indeed, we're speaking of a metaphor that has a long and rich history of use for modeling associational life. Political theory, imperialist ideology, and nationalist discourses of every stripe are replete with family metaphors, and most national anthems contain familial terms, inviting celebration of the beloved motherland or fatherland, the revered forefathers, the heroic brothers in arms, and or the day of glory which has arrived for the children of the nation, as in the French national anthem. But then we know that metaphors are never just metaphors. Part of what is often hinted at in these songs is that if citizens could trace their genealogy back to a distant enough time, they would eventually find common ancestors, an originary ethno-nationalist family in the literal sense. Scholars of metaphor inform us that metaphorical meaning is generated alongside the literal meaning of a word insofar as a principal subject, in our case the world, and a subsidiary subject, in our case the family, are put into relation. To cite one influential account, the metaphor selects and organizes features of the principal subject, the world, by implying statements about it that normally apply to the subsidiary subject, the family, describing the world in terms of or association or comparison with the family. But in the process of doing that, of course, a metaphor also selects and organizes features of the subsidiary subject, the family, to make it suitable for this purpose. So when the world is represented as a family, that affects our understanding of the world, but it also affects our understanding of the family. What are some of the ways in which it does those things? Well, to try and shed light on that, I'd like to put before you three brief case studies, three tropes of international discourse that draw on familiar point for this research, because I work on international human rights law, and we can find that trope right up front in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the very first paragraph of the preamble, where it refers to the fact that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And then in Article 1, the very first substantive article of the Universal Declaration, we read that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, a familial term, obviously there. It seems that this family-related language was introduced into the Declaration by the French jurist René Cassin, who played a central role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Basically, what happened is that Cassin put in something like the language I just read out in the preamble and in Article 1, and in very slightly modified form, that is what was adopted. Incidentally, one of the modifications that was made to Cassin's original language was made by the Indian representative at the Commission on the Status of Women. The main drafting took place in the Commission on Human Rights, but the Commission on the Status of Women, which was set up at the same time, had a watching brief on the drafting, and the Indian representative, Begum Hamid Ali, proposed that an earlier reference by Cassin to the idea that people should regard each other as brothers should instead be replaced by the more abstract language of acting towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And that's what stuck. So that's what we now have in the Universal Declaration. Anyway, what I really want to highlight here is that we have these references to family-oriented language. But apart from that and one or two other minor changes, and apart from one or two questions that were raised about the gendered language of brotherhood, and originally brothers, by the way, that those concerns were squashed by the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, who said that actually the masculine includes the feminine. We know that it doesn't, but that was her perspective at the time. Anyway, apart from those matters, Cassin's language in those slightly modified ways was adopted in the Declaration with virtually no discussion. So there was, and still is, in the literature about the Universal Declaration and about human rights generally, no discussion of what it might mean to figure humankind as a family. There was no discussion of whether, if human unity, if solidarity, if equality and non-discrimination were to be the guiding principles, as Cassin elsewhere suggested they should be, whether, if they were to be the guiding principles, the metaphor of the family was a good vehicle for communicating that. That was simply assumed without discussion. Well, around the same time as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was coming into being, another project of a different sort was getting going in the United States, which also thematized the idea of the human family. And this other project was a photographic exhibition entitled The Family of Man. Some of you may know this. I was familiar with it because when I was a child, my parents had that book, that catalogue, on their bookshelves. I come originally from Australia, and this exhibition must have come to Sydney, and my parents will have seen it well before I was born, but that catalogue was in our home. And so I was interested to be reminded of this when I started thinking about the idea of the human family. I want to pause over this exhibition a bit, because in contrast to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights' references to the human family, this exhibition, with its idea of the world as a single family, a family of man, was at the time it was held, I'll say more about that in a moment, and has subsequently also been the subject of a huge amount of discussion and debate. It was first shown, the exhibition was first shown at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1955. And it's widely regarded as one of the most successful photographic exhibitions ever staged. It set the template for the blockbuster photographic exhibition of subsequent decades. Anyway, the general idea of this exhibition was to showcase the essential similarity that underlies the tremendous diversity of the world. The curator, Edward Steichen, a man who actually was born in Luxembourg, but had moved to the United States at a young age, as he explained, he put on the exhibition to, now quoting, express my own very firm belief that we are all alike on this earth, regardless of race or creed or color. And end of quote. And then there was particular emphasis in this exhibition on the family, on family groups and family relationships. So there were images of husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, extended family groups, parents and children, lots of photographs of children in this exhibition. So in this show, the eponymous family of man worked at two levels. At one level, it was a metaphor in which humanity was redescribed as all one big family. At another level, though, it was an invitation to repose faith in the literal family as that which could heal a fractured and dangerous world. 1955, the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation was the backdrop to all of this. So the idea, I think, that Steichen had and was wanting to communicate was that the family was that which could give security, tranquility, and stability to humankind. Well, it was an invitation to repose faith in the family, but which family were the viewers supposed to repose faith in? Well, for many analysts of the exhibition at the time and subsequently, a striking feature of this exhibition, The Family of Man, was that it universalized the nuclear family, the bourgeois nuclear family of the heterosexual married couple and their children as the essential family form, the universal family form. After the exhibition closed in New York, versions of it went on tour around the world. I mentioned that it even reached Australia. But one of the earliest places where it was shown outside the United States was Paris, where it was visited by the critical scholar Roland Barthes, who lent a skeptical eye to Steichen's ambition to present a mirror of universal humanity. So, according to Barthes, everything here, the content and appeal of the pictures and the discourse which justifies them, aims to suppress the determining weight of history. Overall, Barthes' judgment, as later expanded in an essay that was republished as part of his book Mythologies, as it's translated into English. Overall, his judgment was that this exhibition, The Family of Man, made human actions look eternal, the better to diffuse their political potency. So he was concerned about the way in which some idea of humanity and indeed the family was being eternalized, put outside history, outside politics, and made to seem the universal, timeless notion of what humanity and the family are. Well, obviously, a photographic exhibition is also an artifact of its time and place, and it too shouldn't be eternalized. But Barthes' critique seems to me to have wider resonance, including for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and its references to the human family. And by the way, part of the reason for introducing this exhibition into the discussion is that in some of the literature on human rights and photography, the exhibition has been characterized as a visual proxy for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted, of course, some years earlier, but in roughly the same period. So Barthes' critique, I think, has wider resonance in the sense that it reminds us that abstracting human affairs from history and politics and insisting on the essential oneness of all humanity does not put an end to social divisions and the hierarchies they carry forward. It only invisibilizes them. Let me now turn to my second case study. A trope very familiar to students of international relations and international law is the family of nations. Today, we talk about the international community, or perhaps sometimes about the international system. But from the end of the 18th century until the Second World War, it seems that the family of nations was the favored concept for talking about states considered collectively. It's been suggested that the idea of conceptualizing international society in this manner can be traced to the German scholar and writer Friedrich Schiller, who spoke at his inaugural lecture at the University of Jena in 1789 of how, I'm now quoting, the European Society of States seems transformed into a great family, eine große Familie. In the work of 19th century international legal scholars, this concept became linked to the standard of civilization as the formal mechanism by which European states arrogated to themselves the right to grant or deny international status, delimit the application of international norms, and more generally calibrate the rights and duties of sovereign statehood. So, for example, T.J. Lawrence wrote in 1895 that, to quote, membership in the family of nations, I'm now paraphrasing a bit, is restricted to those who possess certain characteristics. Notably, he writes, a certain degree of civilization is necessary, though it is difficult to define the exact amount. Writing at the beginning of the 20th century, Lasse Oppenheim, in his 2-volume work on international law, the first volume on the law of peace, provided perhaps the fullest account in English of the family of nations and its significance and history. He informed his readers that, again quoting now, for hundreds of years, the community of civilized states has been called the family of nations. And that this was originally, he says, a product of Christian civilization, but over time it had been extended to civilized states beyond Christendom, insofar as those states which formed the original family of nations had consented to the reception of new members. In the light of this progressive extension, Oppenheim proposed that states could be classified by their successive entrances into the family of nations. So first there were the old Christian states of Western Europe. Next, there were the Christian states which grew up outside Western Europe, the United States, the former colonies of Spain and Portugal in Latin America, and so on. Then there was Turkey, then Japan, and then there were some other complicated or doubtful cases he discusses. Colonized peoples at the time he was writing, remained outside the family of nations for him. And he said it was a matter of discretion how they should be treated, whether any norms of international law should be applied to them. That wasn't obligatory. But although colonized peoples remained outside the family of nations, it's notable for our purpose that familial language was again used to express relations with them. Specifically, they were assimilated to children in need of paternal direction. This was no hidden secret of imperial ideology, as you will know very well. Regarding India, the historian Uday Mehta has written that, I'm now quoting from Mehta, childhood is a theme that runs through the writings of British liberals on India with unerring constancy. From James Mill's depiction of India as a land in the infancy of the progress of civilization, to Thomas Macaulay's call for the British to be like fathers, who are at times just and unjust, moderate and rapacious, to the younger Mill's belief in British rule as a means of gradually training the people to walk alone. All coalesce, writes Mehta, around the same general point. India is a child for which the empire offers the prospect of legitimate and progressive parentage, and towards which Britain, as a parent, is similarly obligated and competent. The anthropologist Anne McClintock has a fascinating reading of Henry Rider Haggard's late Victorian bestseller, King Solomon's Mines, that's in her work, Imperial Leather. She has a fascinating reading of that late Victorian novel as a dramatization of the theme of the white father as the head of the global family of man, to quote her phrase. At a later moment, the mandate system of the League of Nations, under Article 20, established under Article 22 of the League Covenant, as you know, the mandate system operated under the sign of that same figure, with its emphasis on the tutelage of peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, to cite the language of Article 2 of the League Covenant. Later still, when in 1949, the Commonwealth of Nations was constituted as a mechanism by which Britain could retain ties with newly independent India, despite this country's assumption of republican status, the white paterfamilias was in evidence again. As we learn from one account of these events, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee was able, I'm now quoting, to maneuver the figure of the king from an abstract symbol connoting authority into a father figure, and effectively reinvent the family trope as a metaphor for unity. In post-colonial times, the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, is indeed the context where, at least in English, the language of the family of nations is most often heard. It seems that the concept was held especially dear by the late Queen, who, in the first of her annual Christmas broadcasts, which took place in 1952, sorry, that's Attlee, and there's the Queen as a young woman giving the first of her annual Christmas broadcasts in 1952, she addressed the British nation in that broadcast with the following words: "We belong, you and I, to a far larger family, the British Commonwealth and Empire, that immense union of nations with their homes set in all four corners of the earth. Like our own families, it can be a great power for good." But if the Commonwealth and Empire were not just a family of nations, but also a family of families, it's instructive to recall that only 2 months before Elizabeth II made that speech, the British government had declared a state of emergency in Kenya, unleashing against the territory's freedom fighters the most ferocious violence at the hands of their enraged and unsparing father. This presumptive metaphor for unity was certainly not a metaphor for equality, any more than it was a metaphor for respect, reciprocity, or non-violence. Underlying these investments in the family of nations is an idea of childhood as the developmental past of the mature adult. Ashis Nandi, whose work I'm sure you will all know better than I, once characterized that idea as the theory of progress applied to the individual life cycle. The theory of progress applied to the individual life cycle. And interestingly, Nandi has an argument that, I'm now quoting from him, much of the pull of the ideology of colonialism can be traced to the evolutionary implications of the concept of the child in the Western world view, obviously bringing his psychoanalytic insight to these issues. But even as childhood may be used to evoke our past, we know that it is equally used to symbolize our future. And this is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the present day discourses relating to climate change, where the constant refrain that we hear is of averting or limiting catastrophe for the sake of our children. Likewise, the image making associated with climate change places children front and center. At the COP26 climate summit that was held some years ago in Glasgow, EU Vice President Frans Timmermans is reported to have held up a photograph on his phone of a 1-year-old child, declaring, if the COP fails, my grandson will fight with other human beings for water and food. So 1.5 degrees Celsius is about avoiding a future for our children and grandchildren that is unlivable. As my third and final case study, I want to dwell briefly on this trope of the child as the future, or in another common formulation, the child as the stand-in for future generations. Here, of course, we're in the realm not so much of metaphor as of metonymy. As with metaphor, metonymy involves the substitution of one thing for another, or the description of one thing in terms of another. But rather than being invited to compare or analogize, we're encouraged to notice association, proximity, or contiguity. By definition, no one can be in the future, but underpinning this trope is the idea that the child is close to the future. In 21st century parlance, we might say that the child is future adjacent. The point of foregrounding the child in talk about climate change is obviously to highlight the urgency of the problem by bringing a phenomenon with long-range effects into the near future. Foregrounding the child is presumably also a way of mobilizing action to address climate change by identifying inaction or inadequate action with parental irresponsibility. A further advantage of foregrounding the child here might be that it serves to promote optimism. According to a centuries-old strand of thought, childhood is associated with innocence, purity, and uncorrupted nature. So putting the child at the center of climate change discourse seems to evoke the possibility of reversing the corruption of our world, stepping out from the darkness of global warming and allowing us to be carefree and joyful once again. So it's no surprise that the trope of the child has proved attractive to those engaged in climate change activism and norm setting. But again, I think we need to pause over this way of framing things. One of my LSE law colleagues, Stephen Humphreys, has made some valuable arguments that are relevant here, I think, about how the emphasis on future generations unhelpfully diverts attention from the uneven impacts, historic legacies, and indeed current realities of climate change, making it seem as though the problem was all about our children, some vast undifferentiated mass of people that's supposed to incarnate the impacts of climate change. But in addition to those points, I want to highlight the familiar idea that climate change action is a project of salvation undertaken with children at the forefront of our minds. An example of that appeared in media coverage of COP28 in Dubai, where children were holding up a banner with the words "Save the World" printed on it in primary colored letters. In accounting for the salvationary narrative that subtends the trope of the child as the future, English literature scholar Rebecca Sheldon has proposed that despite the fact that children's own activism, as we see there, is often itself involved, the concern here for the future of the child is really a concern not so much for children themselves as for their reproductive potential, their capacity to follow a life script that includes eventually becoming parents themselves. Here she draws on work by American queer theorist Lee Edelman, who in his book from 2004, No Future, coined the phrase reproductive futurism to refer to the idea that the only futures which children are permitted to have are those passed on to children of their own. Of course, species survival is an important matter and has its own logic, but Edelman wants to challenge the idea that reproduction has to be the beginning and end of all considerations of and dispositions towards the future. Reflecting on the conjunction between parenthood and environmental stewardship, another queer theorist, Sarah Ensor, highlights a more recent book by Sandra Steingraber entitled Raising Elijah. The subtitle is Protecting Our Children in a Time of Environmental Crisis. In this book, excuse me for a second. In this book, Steingraber makes the argument, now quoting, that the environmental crisis is a parenting crisis. It undermines my ability, she writes, to carry out two fundamental duties: to protect my children from harm and to plan for their future. Excuse me. As Ensor summarizes the book, Steingraber's response to this situation is to redouble her efforts to quarantine her children from the dangers and toxicities they face, to feed them organic food, to exclude all PVC plastic from their home, and so on. Ensor wants us to consider the way climate change activism can become a matter of seeing to your own interests, if and to the extent that you have the privilege of doing so. If the world is a family, I've prompted us to ask, what kind of family is it? One answer might be to say that it doesn't matter. Speaking of the world as a family is just a piece of empty verbiage, a commonplace that shouldn't be investigated too closely or taken too seriously. But that answer surely cannot stand, since commonplace or not, speaking of the world as a family has effects. The successive case studies I've sketched suggest that representing the world in familial terms has served to elide social hierarchies, emphasize unity at the expense of our awareness of social divisions and hierarchies. It's worked in tandem with the so-called civilizing mission to justify the subjugation, exploitation, and ill-treatment of peoples. And it's rationalized salvationary, self-centered, and prevaricative approaches to dealing with pressing global problems such as climate change. It's important to acknowledge that these things are not all that family language and the beliefs and actions associated with it have done. The language of Black brothers and sisters, for example, has long been a feature of African American emancipatory discourses in the United States, as has the language of sisterhood in feminist organizing, just to mention those couple of examples. So taking on board that for worse, but also sometimes for better, the representation of the family has effects, a more adequate answer to the question, what kind of family is it, needs to reckon with the ideas about the family which this metaphor mobilizes to its diverse purposes. As my case studies have ranged across epochs and locations, we've seen how family figurations in international discourse have picked out a variety of family types. The post-war American nuclear family, in my first case study, the human family, the family of man exhibition. The Victorian family of long 19th century England, in my second case study, the family with the stern paterfamilias that informs the idea of the family of nations. And the middle-class millennial parented family of Western societies in the current era, in my third case study with their obsession with organic food and the exclusion of PVC plastic. Great though those things clearly are, but signs of privilege that they also are. It scarcely needs stating that those family types correspond less to widespread actual practices of family life, whether in the West or anywhere else, than to specific hegemonic but contested notions prevalent at those particular historical junctures in those places or regions of what family life should be, what kind of family deserves accreditation as such. Representations of the world as a family do not, of course, constitute a uniform or invariant body of discourse. All the same, one persistent element seems to be this emphasis that we've seen on unity. The oneness of the multitude seems to be what's being communicated by this idea of the world as a family. And to offer a final perspective on that, and I'll finish shortly, I want to return to the beginning of my talk, India's G20 slogan. And Professor Mattu has referred to the fact that this resonates deeply for people in this country. But I want to highlight a potential ambiguity, which I learned about reading the work of a scholar of Sanskrit. Actually, he's based in the United States, Brian Hatcher, who explains that the mantra's context, you'll know a lot more about this than me, but according to him, the context is a gnomic verse, which he translates in a bit along the lines that you suggested, slightly differently, and I'll just read his translation. The narrow-minded like to ask, is this person one of us or is he a stranger? But to those of noble character, the whole world is a family. So basically, yes, as you put it. Well, according to this scholar, it's not possible to say when that verse first appeared, but he highlights an early occurrence of it in the Sanskrit ethico-didactic story literature of the first millennium and first half of the second millennium of the Common Era. And I find this story quite intriguing for our topic today. So I'm just going to retell it and then sum up. So the particular story to which this scholar directs our attention as an early instance of that mantra is a story about a jackal who was hungry and decided to kill a deer. The deer was friends with a crow who looked out for it. So the jackal knew that he wouldn't be able to catch the deer and kill it unawares. So ambling up to the deer and the crow, the jackal introduced himself and said, I'm a lonely beast. I want to be your friend. But the crow was dubious. And the crow said, one should never take in strangers. And to illustrate his point, he related a story about a cat that saw some birds in a tree. As the cat drew close to the tree, he noticed that there was a vulture nearby. The vulture shouted at the cat, get out of here, or I will surely kill you. By telling a tall story about taking up the path of holiness and becoming a vegetarian, the cat managed to win over the vulture, who then reassured the birds that the cat posed no threat to them. And so the cat, the vulture stood aside. The cat then came along. The birds came down to greet the cat, but no sooner had they done that than the cat ate them up and made its escape. And so coming back to the jackal and the crow and the deer. So the crow says to the jackal, you see, one should be wary of inviting strangers to remain with us. The jackal took great offense at this and said, listen, my friend, you too were once a stranger to the deer. And look, now the two of you are great friends. And in righteous indignation, the jackal recited the verse. The narrow-minded like to ask, is this person one of us, or is he a stranger? But to those of noble character, the whole world is a family. The crow was impressed by these honorable sentiments and let the jackal stay with him and the deer. The jackal waited for the right moment to kill a deer, but before he could do so, the crow realized the danger and rescued his friend, and then the jackal was killed by a local farmer. So the key takeaway from this story, which I think is intriguing and on which this scholar Hatcher invites us to reflect, is that the recitation of the verse here was not a morally elevated act of the kind that one would seek to emulate. It was a cynical ploy based on a fraudulent wisdom in this context. So the jackal wasn't out to revolutionize social relations. He wasn't out to change a world that at some level is not one family, is full of hierarchy and division and violence. All the jackal wanted was his next meal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I
Thank
spoke for
you.
too long. I just went.
No, this is. Thank you, Susan, for that fantastic talk. Scholarly, insightful, and towards the last, extremely entertaining as well. And now, I think the original shloka is from the Maha Upanishad, but this looks like a story from the Panchatantra. Yeah, I don't know whether that's true.
It's pretty heavily distributed.
Yeah.
Okay.
In Sanskrit, there's a lot.
Out of whether this is from the Panchatantra or not, and whether the Panchatantra predates the Upanishad is another. But it's fantastic, and really, I enjoyed your talk so much. But I'm sure others did. So, if with your permission, can I be open
Of
into the
course.
house? Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Students or faculty or yes, Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Professor Marks. This was beyond fascinating. And indeed, we did have a start to this conversation in the year that India was hosting the G20. And the slogan that you started with was really doing the rounds, and everyone was talking about it in very complimentary terms. And there were times when we asked whether one is to take as a given the fact that the projection of the family metaphor is all positive, or whether there are possibilities entrenched, like you said, within the family unit, which need to be explored more deeply. I was very interested to hear the three examples that you used, and especially the reference to the adult and the child. I was wondering that another aspect which is very specific to the Indian family, and of course many others in the world as well, is the whole idea of patriarchy, which is entrenched in the families. Does that appear in your connection of this whole idea to international law? A second small question, if I'm allowed to ask it, is that after seeing the topic of your talk, I was also thinking of specific legal principles in international law, many of which draw from the family, but can draw basically fall either way. And just to use specific examples, from security, for instance, the idea of collective security, the idea of all for one for all, that we are a family and any common enemy makes us work together. The sort of Article 5 of the NATO sort of formulation would in fact work in favor of the idea of the family. However, a principle from international trade law, such as national treatment, would in fact work against, where you are blindfolded and you're not allowed to give favorable treatment to your family vis-a-vis the outsider in terms of trade law. So how would this all, sort of fall in terms of specific legal principles which are now taken for granted as part of international law?
Do you want to answer that one, or should we take a few questions?
As you prefer.
Yeah, maybe we can take a couple of them. And there's a yes. Can we have the mic there, please? Or you can speak into the mic
Um,
and identify yourself, please.
hello, ma'am. My question is that like when you talk of like family, right? So we are basically, when you made the argument that we are abstracting, we're creating an abstraction when the reality of social division exists, right? Across countries, within countries. So, ma'am, I just want to ask the question, like, how do you see, like, when we talk of this sort of formal equality that we are talking about, the discourse of formal equality, which is a liberal discourse, how much do you think that this liberal discourse, where you are keep on talking about equality, 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 but you don't actually do anything, or you, because of that, for instance, like when you talk of like in the US, the color blindness in the laws like has led to the incarceration of, mostly if you see, they're African American men who are incarcerated. So my question is, do you think that there is a link between this liberal discourse and the rise of fascism that we are seeing all across the world in today's time?
Can you identify yourself, please?
Parliament.
And where are you? Are you doing a master's or?
I'm in PhD, International Legal Studies.
Okay, thanks. Any one more, and then we'll come to Susan as well. Yeah, Professor Sun. What?
So this mic doesn't work. So,
Okay. Yeah, there's a mic coming your way.
that was absolutely fascinating. Great stuff. And my thought is this: I mean, can any metaphor metonymy really survive scrutiny? I mean, if you were not the family, if it were the club, if it were the trade union, you can pretty much think of any kind of social organization, and there are always its inclusions and exclusions. There are other hierarchies. The political scientist in me would say that, look, it's ultimately about interests, how interests are defined, distributions of power, and that they exist in all settings. And definitely within the family setting. Now international law is essentially about self-interested states getting together and seeking to cooperate because in certain circumstances, interdependence, etc., just lead to better outcomes than sort of not doing so. Then it seems to me that sort of, in a way, no metaphor can ever really get to that. Or am I wrong here? I mean, would you, from an international legal perspective, suggest to us that there could be another metaphor or metonymy that sort of would work better in some ways?
Do you want to take those, Susan?
Yes. Thank you. Great questions, all of them, and comments. Thank you so much. Firstly, I would love to speak to you further about hear further about the debates around the choice of the G20 slogan. That would be fascinating to me. So please, can we be in touch about that? Because that's relevant to my ongoing research. The fact that there were questions raised about how, while it's appealing, there could be not so positive aspects. Patriarchy, yes, is of course part of this project. I didn't present it as one of the case studies because I was trying to choose case studies that would be short and snappy in this context, but I've been starting to write about that as well. So I've been researching, so obviously down to the present, gender equality is a phenomenon that reflects patriarchal power relations. But I've been looking at the 17th and 18th centuries, the Glorious Revolution in England, and then the Revolution in France. The idea of the killing of the king understood as the father, and his replacement by a band of brothers, the establishment of the idea of fraternity. And as you probably know, there are political theorists like Carol Pateman and so on who are saying we need to take seriously that these were brothers, that patriarchal relations, the relations between husbands and wives, and fathers and daughters remained in place. What changed were the relations between fathers and sons. There's a whole lot of really interesting writing about the place of the father, which we know has long been an important metaphor for the king or the ruler of whatever type, but also is bound up with literal the literal power of fathers in families. So definitely that will be part of my ongoing research. Your point about international law, the specific principles of international law and how they seem to be pushing us in contradictory directions, wanting us to hug others close, but also ignore quasi-family ties. That is fascinating. I have to admit, I haven't been thinking along those lines, but thank you for the suggestion. I will do so now. Thank you so much. The question about formal equality, is there a link between a liberal discourse that encourages us to emphasize forms at the expense of realities and the rise of populist nationalism? I believe there is, yes. We know that color blindness doesn't work, or it leads to the kinds of outcomes that you highlighted. And that's a lesson that we should have taken from thinkers over a very long period, back to Marx, but before Marx as well. Formal equality has its uses, but it also encourages us to think that the surface level, the forms, will bring about change in the social realities. And we know that we can't read off substantive change from formal recognition of equality and rights. So I completely agree with the drift of your question and comment. Can any metaphor survive? Do I have a better metaphor? No, I don't have a better metaphor. Do I know whether there's, can any better metaphor survive? Scrutiny. I don't know. I'm not kind of criticizing the family as a metaphor for the world. What I'm doing is noticing that it is a very prominent metaphor that has quite strong appeal and seems to derive its power from, indeed, the fact that we all have a family, like it or not. And by the way, I'm not doing this project because I don't have a happy family. As it happens, I do. I'm one of the lucky ones, I think. I'm one of the lucky ones because I think globally that's not necessarily the norm. So I'm not advocating for or against this metaphor or any other metaphor. I'm simply, my starting point is simply to notice that this looms very large in international discourses of various kinds, and therefore it seems worthwhile to think about how it orients the way we think and make policy and therefore act, starting from the assumption that discourses have significance as forms of action in themselves. So, and just to add something inspired by your comments, there'll always be power, there'll always be uneven distributions of power, there'll always be inclusions and exclusions, perhaps, but we still need to understand who those distributions of power favor and who they disfavor, who gets included and who gets excluded, because it turns out that it's the same people and groups who continually get excluded and disfavored and marginalized within societies and across the world. And we need to understand why that's happening. And this may be a very tiny piece of that puzzle.
Professor Basu and Professor Mishra, and then the gentleman on the back seat.
Thank you. I'd just like to, if we could bring in the subaltern, and that, what would that do to this whole debate on the family, where I feel tackling the liberal aspect of it is easier, but then there is the limitations of looking at it, of what happens within the family, reproduction, etc. Those debates come in, productive work, what is considered work, and then at a larger level, at the level of global politics, capital. How does capital bring in the family discourse? So you have family firms, you have gig workers who are now being called partners. So there is a new vocabulary which is coming in. Incidentally, one of my students, she's not here, she's away on a field work. She's working on the changing discourses on sexuality and family at the United Nations, tracing that and thing. So it would be interesting to hear, the whole power dynamics of that. Thank you.
Sandeep?
Yeah, I think I have to make a small comment about your story, the last story which you, it's very interesting. But probably the story doesn't fully apply to this ayam nija paraveti gadana laguchetasam. Udar basudha, udar charitanam tu basudha kutumbukam. The slope which we are referring to. And why I'm saying that, uh, suppose these two people, like suppose the crow is being convinced, that like like how they can live together. Being friend doesn't mean that we are we are going to be ignorant about our limitations. Like cat cannot start flying, or say cat cannot be vegetarian or something. So I think there are given limitations, structural limitations in that friendship and familyship means that I think we need to be creating institutions, mechanism through which a friendship, even in family, there are norms, there are right etiquettes and behaviors, there are hierarchies, there are other, you can say. So I think my point is that basically saying that family means that everybody is having, I think, there's a chance of exploitation. So those things are basically less important. More important is that normally the existing family which we see, they have cruelty, they have hierarchy, they have all other problems which you mentioned. So, are we, when we are talking about family of nations or family of human family, are we able to create a mechanism of cooperation and like going together and basically uh, putting aside all the problematic elements of family which are there in practice? So that's more important than anything else. Thank you.
Yes. Could you please identify yourself?
Right. Yeah. I'm Bhaskarjit. I teach philosophy in the Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences. That was fascinating. Really enjoyed the talk. I think my concern is mainly from the point of view of morality and ethics there. When you talk about a family, world as a family, that metaphor works great. It has a lot of explanatory power and efficacy. But when you talk about the entire world as a family, uh, I feel concerned about the agency question here. Does it have an agential status? When you talk about the family as a unit, it does have an agency, so to speak. It does have some sort of decision procedure structure, decision mechanism structure, or an international organization can be said to have certain structure based on which it can exhibit its agential capacities. Now, when you talk about the entire world as a community, uh, does it really have that agential status? And how does it make a particular decision when it comes to moral properties, when you have to attribute obligation or responsibility, and how do you make sense of that? When a structure collective makes a decision and that decision is an agential decision, that works fine. But when the entire world community is making a decision, now whose decision is this? It doesn't have any structure. So I have a bit of an issue there. I don't know how you see it, but I think the analysis doesn't really work well there. Sorry, thank you.
Professor Khan?
Yeah, can be loud enough. Just one uh, comment or rather a question for you. Using the lens of the family that you are using, how do you look at the development of the European Union? What is your assessment of the development of the European Union? And what is its primary challenge that you think it faces today?
Any other? Yeah, Professor Hegde. He's one of the great doyens of international law.
No, I just want to say just one small comment is that metaphors are used in international law only to derail the negotiation, essentially.
To
Deride the
Essentially, you look at all
undermine
the,
negotiations.
you look at climate change negotiations, you look at WTO ministerial meetings. So whenever countries feel that, particularly, I don't have to mention which countries, and they will use the metaphors and that it's finished. So that's one general comment. The other one is that talked about civilized nations thing. It took nearly 70, 80 years to visit the Article 38 clause, subclause C of the 1C, where general principles of civilized nations. I mean, still that word, of course, the International Law Commission is, submitted a report and things like that. But still, I don't think it hasn't gone out of it actually. So still, I think the traces of, so what is civilized, what is not civilized is something which even a lot of Asian scholars are actually debating. Particularly if you look at the articles written in various journals here, you see that they are questioning the entire concept of who actually defines this. So these things have already crept into UN, vocabulary. And now, of course, if you look at ILC debates, you can see that there's a whole lot of problems of defining them again. So these are the two comments I just thought you can. Thank you.
I'll let you respond, but I thought that in terms of the Sanskrit shloka, the other shloka which goes with this, also, although it's from a different Upanishad, is Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina. So, in fact, actually, when the Prime Minister, for instance, speaks, he talks about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, but also Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, which is that peace and prosperity for all. That's from the Madharanayake Upanishad, is it? Okay, sorry? Can you recite the whole shloka, Sandeep?
सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखं
So why don't you translate it as well?
सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः means everybody should be happy. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः. Everybody should become you can say disease free, healthy. सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु. Everybody should look beautiful and good. And मा कश्चित् दुःखं and all problems.
Let all the problems be over. Let everyone be healthy, wealthy, and beautiful. You know the Madharanayake Upanishad from there.
Let all eyes see.
Let all rise.
Can I just add one?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So not so much a question as just a comment, that there's actually, so I work in, I'm an economist, and even in economics, there's some economic historians in some parts of the world like to believe that it's the family structure that has led to a divergence in economic development. So for example, Italy. So the belief is that the northern part of Italy is more economically developed because of the kind of family structures where they were more outward looking and happy to do businesses with people from outside the family, as opposed to southern Italy, which is more within the family unit. So that's also something that's been, family also ends up being important in explaining divergence in economic development across.
Great.
Just to get the translation right, it's may all be happy, may all be free from illness, may all see what is auspicious, not may all be beautiful, but may no one suffer. Om, peace, peace, peace.
Buddhism and other religions also say the same thing.
Yeah, in a different way. This, yeah. Yeah. And Islam is the translation is the language of peace. That is the word of land of peace, the religion of peace. Please.
So thank you again so much for those fantastic questions and comments and corrections. So a subaltern perspective absolutely needs to be brought to this topic. You'll be aware that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels call for the abolition of the family, actually. Or the word they use is Aufhebung, meaning kind of transcendence. And that idea actually has been picked up by some feminist and queer scholars recently, arguing for, not for, of course, the ending of the family, no one would want that, but for a recognition and an effort to make space for alternative structures of intimacy and belonging and care. And part of the backdrop to that is the sense of how the European bourgeois family was bound up with developments in capitalism, definitely. So that would be a longer conversation, but certainly all of those issues belong together. And then there was a question about, or a comment about the sort of structural limitations. Is there a way of putting aside the problematic elements? I don't know. I can't answer that. I'm working here in the mode of critique. I'm just trying to notice an important way of talking and an important discourse, and try and make more visible, bring to the surface some of its implications, so that we know when we're speaking that language what we're potentially committing ourselves to. So I don't have an answer as to whether all of those limitations, structural limitations, could be put aside and we could find some ideal conception of the family which we could use as a template for understanding international cooperation. I don't see one. But maybe there is. So family is as lacking, world as a family lacking agency. Again, I'm not advocating for the idea of treating the world as a family. I'm just noticing that there's this powerful discourse out there that wants us to see human rights as belonging to all members of the human family, wants us to think of the world in terms of a family of nations, wants us to think of climate change in terms of future generations and children and so on. But I think the idea that when we speak of rights as belonging to all members of a human family, the fact that we can't envision agency on that scale or at that level would be another part of the critique, definitely. So I agree with you. The EU as a family, that for somebody who, although I come originally from Australia, I've lived most of my life in the UK, that's a painful subject. Who was raising that? That's a painful subject. As you know, the language of the family was used in the UK. We talk about the divorce bill and eventually the Divorce Act. So the language of severance within a family was used, and that obviously presupposes an idea of the EU as a kind of family. I don't know where that's going. I would love to think that one day, personally, I would love to think that one day the UK will rejoin the EU, but I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. Although, of course, the plates are shifting right now. We're seeing Europe coming together, including the UK, in a new way, for reasons we all know. Metaphors used to derail negotiations. I'm sure that's true, but I don't think that's the only context in which they're used. We know that they have very powerful public appeal in mobilizing support for an issue, for a cause, and indeed in bringing about action. So I think they can be used in all sorts of ways. There's a huge literature, as you will well know, on metaphors in international relations generally. I've just chosen to focus on this. Civilized nation, the idea of civilization, as you rightly say, of course, recurs in the UN era. We find it in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, which talks about the sources of international law to which the ICJ should have regard. It's still there. Of course, it's an embarrassment, but it's there, and we need to work. We need to think about the work that does, and the way in which that carries forward traces from the past. We can't see the idea of the family of nations as a relic of 19th century and early 20th century into pre-UN international law. We've got to think through, and as you say, so many great third world scholars, the Twelve movement scholars, third world approaches to international law scholars, particularly in this country, are doing this work to work out, to illuminate the afterlives of these earlier ideas, which we can, condemn and regard as pernicious now, but it's too easy to do that. We need to see the ways in which they've shaped arrangements, including international legal arrangements, along lines that endure to this day. So that's an important point.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the remarks. May I now ask Dr. Negi to do a formal vote of thanks?
Um, Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and honor to now propose a formal vote of thanks to the speaker for the day. So, Professor Susan Marks, it's been a great pleasure hearing you, especially on this topic. Thank you for bringing a whiff of LSC to JNU. In Harry Potter language, this is called apparition, I think, where you can instantly move to another across distance and space. So I'm sure everyone in this room had an experience of that apparition. As we heard you speak for this fascinating hour, thank you very much for being here and for talking to all of us today. Dean of the School of International Studies, Professor Amitabh Mattu, who has conceived of this whole series of lectures. Thank you very much once again, along with Professor Preeti Singh and her team, who organizes all of the minute details of these functions. You have both been thanked 10 times before. This is the 11th time because of the 11th speaker, but I think it's not enough given the range of brilliant ideas that we've been hearing this year in particular under this series. My colleague Dr. Shakti and his team for making the live streaming possible. So, Professor Marks, a lot of people outside of this room would have listened to this as you spoke and will be listening to this because this will be available online as well. So, thank you very much for making that happen. Thanks to everyone in the room who took time out this forenoon to be here. I'm sure you gained from this, but thank you for joining in and contributing to the conversation. Please join me in a round of applause for the speaker.
What I'll do is I'll go ahead. So I'll go ahead.
Okay.
Preeti will accompany